This is the last week of our series on Galatians, and I was glad that I got this passage. It's a nice, simple little reflection of Paul's. And I wanted to think for a minute about, we started looking at Galatians because our book by Eileen, he says that it's a good resource for a church in anxious times when there's change happening and people are anxious about that. The Jewish people who came to faith in Christ brought their whole tradition of following the law in with them, which really gave them a sense of knowing how it is that they should behave to be right with God, to be doing the right thing. And then when Gentile Christians came in because they'd received the Spirit, it kind of created some turmoil in the community. Do they have to follow the law? And if not, then what is it that what are our guidelines for living? How do we know how we should live? So that's the context of the tension and the turmoil that's being faced in the church that Paul's speaking to. It got me thinking a little bit about the process by which people become citizens. People come to this place from countries all over the world, some of which have very different systems of government, very different relationships between government and the people. Some of them have come with very different traditions and observances of all different kinds. And so I was just kind of wondering about this, bringing immigrants into this country. How is it that we actually become one people? It's kind of analogous to what would have been happening, I think, in a sense, in Paul's church. And so I got on the website of the government naturalization immigration services and looked at this information on how to become a U.S. citizen, and it's very nicely laid out. But one of the things that it spells out is a little place where it says your rights and your responsibilities as a citizen, along with other information that you are supposed to learn. And they spelled out 7 rights: freedom to express yourself, freedom to worship as you wish, right to a prompt fair trial by jury, right to vote in elections, right to apply for federal employment, right to run for elected office, freedom to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then responsibilities: support and defend the Constitution, stay informed of the issues affecting your community, participate in the democratic process, respect and obey the laws, federal, state, and local, respect the rights, beliefs, and opinions of others, participate in your local community, pay income and other taxes honestly and on time to federal, state, and local authorities, serve on a jury when called upon, defend the country if the need should arise. So the rights and the responsibilities of citizens are laid out for people coming in to this new place that they are calling home. And Paul is facing a kind of integrated community and also trying to give them some kind of new guidelines. So what John talked about last week with the works of the Spirit, yielding the fruits of the Spirit, as opposed to the works of the flesh, or what the translation Nikki shared with us is being oriented towards selfish desires. Paul's given these kinds of lists of what spirit life looks like and what selfish desire life looks like. And he said, you were brought together because of the work of the Spirit. So you have spirit life. So that's wonderful. He talks about the freedom we have, but the freedom that we have to live in the Spirit. Now in chapter 6, Paul is getting a little bit realistic. He's talked to them about the law of Christ, being that we love one another. And he said, just live by the Spirit and all these fruits will happen. But he also realizes that human human nature being what it is, that there are probably going to be some dynamics that arise within the community. And that's what he talks about in chapter 6. And I just want to highlight a few things here. So first he thinks about the situation happening when someone living in the community of the Spirit is not doing probably things that are conducive to helping the Spirit. And so his first thing is, you know what, if someone is stepping out of line, if someone's causing trouble for others, or if someone is maybe straying from what they should be doing, you know, it actually is something that you should see as part of your responsibility in community to deal with. You should correct or restore that person. Restore that person, and you should do that in a spirit of gentleness. This, I know, for our culture today, reading those words about how we should restore one another when we've erred really seems really in your business, doesn't it? It seems like, you know, really over the line. We are not necessarily thinking that we're buying into this kind of community of mutual correction. So it probably feels a little bit startling to come to that line. But Paul really sees this community of the Spirit not being one of autonomous beings. Our freedom has not been so that we all can just do our own thing. We're all like, stay in your own lane, keep moving ahead. That might work, but it's not Christ's life. Christ's life is fulfilled in mutual responsibility, mutual care, mutual upbuilding, mutual reinforcement, mutual encouragement, carrying one another's burdens, and thus fulfilling the law. He's using the words, thus fulfilling the law, just exactly as he's set them up in the chapter before when he says the law of Christ is to love one another. Bearing one another's burdens is part of loving one another. And maybe it's the part that he pulls out for some focus because it's the part that is a little more challenging. It's a little more challenging to bear one another's burdens, but that is part of fulfilling the law of Christ's love. Now, so this being in each other's business stuff, Paul emphasizes that the way that we would kind of help realign somebody, the spirit in which we do it, a spirit of gentleness, is as important as the fact of doing it itself. And I'm thankful for that word of advice. I'm not always knowing how exactly to do that, but that is a good word. Don't do it unless you can do it in a spirit of gentleness and mutual upbuilding. In fact, when he says, if anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such a one. That word restore is much different in its connotation than you should correct someone. If you go back to the Gospel of Mark, and remember in the beginning, Jesus calls the disciples by the Sea of Galilee. Some of them have to leave their work of mending their nets, repairing holes in the nets to make them working again. That is the same word that he uses here. Restoring to community is like mending some of the bonds of community so that it's functioning again. So he's giving advice and asking us to each hold each other accountable, but he's really counseling that it can only be done with a spirit of gentleness. And in that way, it's fulfilling the the law of Christ. So bearing one another's burdens, Paul has partly in mind this aspect of helping to keep each other in line, helping to guide each other, helping to even kind of correct each other. And bearing one another's burdens is more than that. It includes being there for people when they're in stress and in sorrow. It includes sometimes sharing what we have to help others who are in times of need. Bearing one another's burdens also can be lifting up a person's spirit and bringing them back to God and through prayer. Bearing one another's burdens assumes that the other person's journey is an important part of your journey. So I guess the first thing I want to pull out from that to ask ourselves is, are we finding places where we are part of Christian community? Where we're not just seeing ourselves as going and getting filled up with our ideas or guidance or wisdom in a sermon or something, but are we participating in some relationships within the community, or perhaps in another Christian community? Are we finding some place where we have relationships that help form the mutual responsibility and accountability and encouragement bonds that Paul imagines are part of life in the Spirit? There are ways that you can take just any kind of activity that happens in the church and decide that you are making it part of your group. You can be on a team that serves together, and you can try to get to know each other, find out what's happening in each other's lives so that you can pray for each other, offer to share about what's going on in your life, what's happening with you spiritually. What do you think God is stirring up in you and working in you? Sometimes we need to just be initiators ourselves of opening up within this community our own bonds of spiritual communion with others, so that we can, at some point, start the process of being vulnerable and transparent and available to others, so that we can participate in this kind of mutual giving and receiving in the Spirit of God. Paul says, when you do that, you have to realize you're taking a little bit of a risk. So he tells them to bear each other's burdens and to correct one another. But he says, be careful now. And he doesn't exactly specify what you should be careful of, but possibly you might be tempted yourself to be led astray. Have you ever, talked to someone about your problems, and they join in painting them so darkly that you start to lose faith yourself as you're sharing with them? Well, they pull you the other way, then you're trying to engage them. That's a risk. Paul says also it can be a risk that we can hear about others' challenges or try to correct others, and we can really get an overblown sense of ourselves as being, well, thank goodness, as one of my friends says, oh no, I'm not going to say that. Horrible to be you inside our heads. So Paul gives kind of advice. Okay, don't be tempted, but also if you think that you're really hot stuff, maybe you need to take a look at yourself a little more closely. So he's really talking about the dynamics of life in a congregation and how people help one another move forward in love and faith for the witness in the world. I think Paul was realistic about the Christian life in many ways. He was realistic because he knew sometimes it's hard to keep giving to keep serving, to keep loving. And so his words were a reminder in the very end, don't give up. We will reap what we sow. What we cultivate in the life of the community, what we cultivate in our own spiritual lives, is something that God recognizes. It's something that God will someday vindicate, even if we don't always see its vindication in the short term. Don't give up from doing what is right, but keep moving forward. I think of some of the challenges that we have in our world today. We know we all have some challenges in our denomination with trying to become inclusive, but there are so many others too. We have the challenges that have just been made so potently known to us, not just this week, but over and over again, that we live in a world with a lot of people who are tempted towards hatred, towards violence, towards just disdain of others. The church is needed more than ever to be a place where we are proclaiming the dignity of each and every person and of God's intention to love all. We are called to be a place where we fight against negative spiritual energies and create love and encouragement and a hopeful future because we're in it all together. We cannot get weary of doing that because God will surely, whether we see it in the short term or not, will vindicate those who are loving and serving and who continue in their lives, in their sacrificial love, to fulfill the law of Christ in the concrete examples and circumstances of each and every day. And I've seen so many blessed examples in this congregation. I don't know where I would start to name them all. I'm grateful for all of the times that I see people reaching out to others to care for them with letters, with visits, with even Facebook posts and comments, and building one another up with people who visit others in the hospital and pray for them weekly through the prayer team. Those kinds of things make an impact in this world. Don't ever think that they don't. We must not grow weary of doing good, for we reap what we sow, and God will harvest and account for all. Amen.